East Asia. In discussing such an enormous history of great length and great diversity, one has to pick and choose. And if we see a greater emphasis, for example, on countries like China or Japan, so be it. Going back into the ancient world, with a country such as China, we're talking about the oldest continuous nation in existence in the history of the world, going back at least 7,000 years. And in that country, we find an attitude that develops over the centuries, an attitude of superiority over the rest of the known world, and we'll see the implications, positive or negative, of that attitude. The Chinese name for China is Cochin, Middle Kingdom, heaven above, and all the rest of the people of the earth below. In other words, that special privileged place that the Chinese saw of themselves, that sense of superiority. And that gave them also an attitude of isolation from the rest of the world. The Great Wall of China across the northern border, that enormous undertaking, an enormous feat of engineering and much brutality to the workers who built it, is a graphic example of that desire for isolation, to keep out the outside world. The self-sufficiency of a country like China could be seen within itself in terms of the history that historians can render, and also afterwards in terms of European travelers who would witness China and see, in contrast, for example, Marco Polo, in contrast to medieval Europe, would see the enormous advantages that China had. Much more civilized in many ways than Europe was in the Middle Ages. All this can be seen. With regard to religion or philosophy, the two terms sometimes are interchangeable with Confucianism, we see an attitude of stability, an attitude of order, that everybody has their place in a kind of hierarchy. The emperor at the top, within the family, the man at the top, talking about very much a patriarchal society. Women seen very lowly in that traditional society. But what we also see is enormous technological development, multi-volume works written on the science of China, remarkable kinds of achievements, in that splendid isolation that they saw themselves in. When Marco Polo visits China at the time that Europe is wallowing in its Middle Ages and reports back this vision of an urban civilization, at first fellow Italians don't believe him. It's too different from Europe at that time. But future travelers will, of course, confirm it. Urban civilization. Enough food to feed people who do not grow their own food, who live in cities. What we also see in traditional China, art classes, of course. One class known as the scholars, referred to the literate class. The emperor, his court, the landowners controlling the land. The second class being the peasants, mostly illiterate, who worked the land in a kind of feudalistic situation. So you have this class situation, which of course is well known to us from most other parts of the world. This is going on in China as well. China, at its apex, by that I mean up to, say, the mid-1600s, may well have been the most powerful country in the world, bar none. Much of the world did not know about China very much until those travelers came and reported back what they had seen. In other words, in its isolationism, it developed this internal power. Not only scientific achievement, but, for example, a civil service, a professional civil service, a bureaucracy to manage the affairs of...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?